What if the reason you still feel broken isn't because you're weak, but because you've experienced something deeper than trauma? In this episode, we're uncovering moral injury, a hidden wound that can happen when your values, your faith, or your identity is violated, especially inside toxic relationships. And most people, including churches, don't even know how to recognize it. Have you ever felt something was wrong but couldn't explain it? Like the person you love was slowly chipping away at your sense of self?
We've been there. Different marriages, but to the same man, with the same toxic pattern. But God was still working.
We're Lizzie and Dina, women of faith, survivors, and truth tellers.
Surviving toxic relationships is for any woman stuck in confusion, healing after betrayal, or searching for her voice again.
You are not crazy.
You are deeply loved. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Surviving Toxic Relationships. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Larry Brant. Dr. Brant is a Navy chaplain and combat veteran with over 16 years of military service and 25 years of experience as a local minister prior to entering the Navy. A board-certified chaplain, he has a proven track record walking alongside service members and veterans through PTSD and moral injury. He approaches these wounds not only as clinical realities, but as deep spiritual and moral struggles. Passionate about helping individuals find their way back from trauma, Dr. Brant is equally committed to challenging the church to wake up, listen, and respond with informed, compassionate pastoral care, especially to those carrying the invisible wounds of this kind of war. So I know, Dr. Brant, you said we can call you Larry. So Larry, welcome to our show today. I'm so excited to have you.
Okay. Well, I grew up in the Midwest, just outside of St. Louis, and married my college sweetheart, be 40 years ago in June. And we have 3 grown children and 2 grandchildren. I promise I won't show pictures. I could, but I won't. But felt the call fairly early to go into the ministry. And actually, the first thing I did was I was a worship pastor and usually did worship and education, worship discipleship, worship youth, something along those lines for 25 years, like you said. And then towards the end of that time, I also volunteered as a police and fire chaplain in the city of Lincoln, Nebraska. And I think God kind of used that to begin to transition me to considering the military. So with that, I went to a denominational training event for chaplains. And while there, met a lot of military chaplains. My wife was with me. And while we were there, I kind of started feeling like God was calling me to military chaplaincy. And like Moses and the burning bush, I tried to tell God how he was wrong. You know, how that happens. God tells us we want to go do, no, God, here's where you're wrong.
Yeah.
And with that, it's funny, every excuse I gave him, it seemed like at the next session, they talked about that very thing. The first thing was, well, God, I'm too old. I was already past the cutoff for coming into the military. Next session, they talked about these things called age waivers. Then the next section, I didn't have the right degree. At that point in time, I had a master's in leadership and a master's in church music. And next thing, they're talking about these new online, fully accredited seminaries that the military is accepting. And I thought, okay, well, I got him on this third one. And at that point in time in my life, I weighed over 300 pounds. And God said, there's this thing called a diet. And so I said, okay, God, we'll do this. I need you to tell my wife. I'm too afraid to. Because she was there with me. And because as much as I can, she'll go with me to these things because I want to hear her perspective, you know, how God is speaking to her through what we're experiencing and vice versa. So we get back to the room that night, and I'm just absolutely dreading what I feel God is telling me to do because I know it's just going to completely change everything. And I close the door, and before I can say the first word, she puts her finger in my face and says, I think God's calling you to military chaplaincy.
Wow.
And I was like, well, you don't really have much of a better confirmation than that. So over the next year and a half, I went back to school, got my Master's of Divinity, lost 110 pounds, and
That's amazing.
joined the Navy at age 45.
Wow.
Uh, Less than a year later, found myself with a Marine Infantry battalion in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. And that's really where my journey with moral injury began. Also, PTSD. For a lot of years, I denied that I had PTSD, but I finally admitted it. When someone on multiple occasions tries to kill you, uh, that will do that to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's awful.
But my religious program specialist is what they're called, and my Marines took great care of me. Whenever I was in danger, they kept me safe. And the hardest thing was when we found evidence that had not only a description saying if you take out the Marines' religious leader, you'll demoralize them. Along with that, when we found it, was a description of my RP and myself.
And what's
So
RPing? Sorry, I don't know what that means.
that was the religious program. In the Navy, you'll have the chaplain, and then his or her assistant is called a religious program specialist, and we call them RPs for short. And so there was a description of myself and the RP. So we knew that someone had gotten close enough to actually write down what our description was and get that out to the insurgents.
And what did that do?
It put a target on our back. It literally put a target on our back because they were saying these are the guys you need to kill the most because it will demoralize the Marines.
So I see. So the opposing forces were like, get these guys out, kill them, okay, because then the forces will have a really hard time after that and they'll be weaker, basically.
Of course, they didn't realize that it would probably actually do the exact opposite. It would just make the Marines madder.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then from that day forward, all sense of safety was gone.
Mm,
And then
okay.
also, the Marines having to take a life, even though it was in the course of what they were doing, they struggled with that. And I still talk with Marines from that deployment in 2011 to this very day. Some of them are still in, some of them are out of the Corps and have moved on with their lives, and some of them still struggle. But from that point forward, so for the last 16 years, I've been a Navy chaplain, and then a few years ago, I was accepted into an education program called the Navy's Clinical Pastoral Education Program. Then I did a residency with the San Diego VA, and a good portion of that residency, I actually worked in a PTSD domiciliary in San Diego. So what that means is, and it's called the Aspire Center, and I wish the VA would replicate it in every single location. Because what they do is they take homeless veterans off the streets of San Diego. They help them to get clean. They work with them on their PTSD and moral injury and help them to stay clean. They help them find a job and they help them find housing, and they've got about an 85% success rate, which is amazing.
That's impressive. You're mentioning places because that's where my boys, they were both here in San Diego for the same. So it's like when you mentioned Balboa and everything else, I didn't even realize. That's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, and the people who work there are so dedicated to the veterans. Not all of them are veterans, but it doesn't matter. They are just dedicated to those veterans. And this is very refreshing because it doesn't happen in every place. They give the chaplain an equal seat at the table. So when they sit down and they talk about the plan for treatment for a particular resident in those 6 months, the chaplain not only has a voice, the chaplain's expected to say something and be a part of the plan.
I absolutely love
Wow.
that. That kinda gave me goose chills because there's nothing like a team. When a person is down, that team is so critical in making those next steps of healing.
Yeah. And then when I did my residency at the Naval Hospital, this was during the height of COVID. And so I was the ICU chaplain. And to be honest, I saw more death there than I did in Afghanistan. We were losing on
Wow.
average a patient a day to COVID.
Wow.
Um, and it wasn't because of the staff. They were so dedicated, but they were hurting themselves. That's where their moral injury came in, because they felt like they were letting people down, even though they were doing everything they knew how to do. But it just weighed on them so heavily. I had so many conversations with healthcare providers who just they felt like they should just give up and walk away because they didn't feel like they were making a difference anymore. And so they sent me to 29 Palms, which is interesting, being a Navy person and being sent to the middle of the Mojave Desert. But this is the largest Marine Corps training base. And we'll have, in the course of a year, 50,000 Marines, Navy, and foreign military come through this base for training. And so I was sent here to be the command chaplain for the hospital. So I saw some of the things that we used at the Aspire Center, and my thinking was, why are we waiting until these folks are homeless on the streets of San Diego to deal with some of these things? Because we already had very dedicated, but also very overwhelmed mental health providers here dealing with things. I do not want to say that they were slacking, because they were not. They were just so overwhelmed. So I took what we were using at the Aspire Center and I tweaked it for active duty. And I went to the leadership of the hospital and I said, I would like to do this. This is an 8-week course where we use a person's spirituality, their faith, maybe the faith they left as a childhood, maybe a new faith, something to help deal with their PTSD and moral injury. And it's a great program written by a clinical psychiatrist and a reserve Army chaplain who's a full-time VA chaplain. And thankfully, the leadership at the hospital said, we think this is a terrific idea. So much so that the executive officer of the hospital, who was a clinical psychiatrist, said, chaps, I'd like to lead this with you. And it was terrific. And we saw so many good things happen through that. It's an 8-week course. And, we talk about forgiveness, both for others and for themselves. We talk about why does God allow evil in the world? We talk about steps toward beginning to trust others again. And a big part of it is when we have that group together, it helps these folks to understand I'm not the only one who feels this way. I'm because that's a big part of moral injury. And I know you've got the question, what is moral injury? I'll just go ahead and dive into it. We know PTSD is fear-based. PTSD is that trauma from being in a situation where we were possibly afraid for our life, but definitely we thought we were going to be hurt or were, either emotionally, physically, and so that traumatizes us. And that trauma can really affect a person's faith, They may think, well, why did God allow this to happen? God doesn't love me anymore. That's why this happened. And there's just a myriad of things that can go through. And so as we began to work with these, we saw changes. We saw big changes. We saw one gentleman who, have you ever met someone and it just looked like they were going to bite your head off?
Yeah, most definitely.
That was this gentleman. He was kind of considered in his workplace Mr. Grumpy Pants. He was a retired Marine. Whenever someone asked him a question, he would treat them like they were an idiot and bite their head off. And one of our chaplains on base was visiting in his office and just said, you might want to try this. This might be something that would be good for you. And so he came that first night, and my partner and I were like, is he coming back? We're really not sure do we want him to come back? Because, he just was.
There's always one in the bunch, right? I mean,
but then as he started coming back, he actually took the notebook that we gave him. And so he took the workbook that we gave them that first night and took it to his mental health provider at the VA. And to her credit, she adjusted her schedule with him so that she would meet with him a few days after we would meet, and she would talk about the very same subject to kind of complement and reinforce what we had discussed in the group. That was just sheer genius on her part.
And the
And
Yeah.
then when we came to week 7, his demeanor through everything began to change. It was interesting, where he wouldn't talk to anyone, then he was talking to everyone. And that next to last night, he hadn't deployed in 20 years, but he'd done some things on those deployments he was not proud of. And he had never shared those with his wife. And so as we think about that, PTSD is fear and trauma-based. Moral injury is when we choose to do something or choose not to do something, or are ordered to do something by someone in authority over us that goes against everything we believe, morally, ethically, spiritually, emotionally. And then after it happens, we're just completely broken. And that was
So,
and so as we're working with him, that next to last night, he comes and he shares something from one of the deployments, and the group just completely reinforces him, supports him. The healthcare provider, the mental health provider talks about it from a mental health perspective. You know, I say something about it from a spiritual perspective. And then he says, for the last 20 years, I've been pushing away my wife and my daughter because, and this is key in moral injury, I didn't want to infect them with what I had, because they will push away their faith, their family, their friends, because they think it's better that they're isolated, because then they can't do something or they can't infect those people with the evil that they believe is inside them.
wow, that's profound. And the reason that I was really interested in bringing you on with us, Larry, is because this is a really different and interesting perspective that we can frame for our audience of women, mostly women, who have been in these situations, in these, dire toxic relationships. And a lot of them, now that you describe moral injury, I know that they have been exposed to moral injury because they've been in a situation, right, where they have this authority figure, and
Mhm.
most of them are faith-based. So of course they are believing that this authority figure, per God, is the final authority in their life. And so they do and believe and act on things, or put up and tolerate things, right, that are injurious to their heart, their soul, their mind, their conscience. So since that is our audience, can you help us out with some nice little gold nuggets of, women in these situations with, and many of them do have PTSD as well.
Mhm.
And what could you give them that could help them feel that they have some hope and they have a way out of how they're feeling?
First thing I want to say is God loves you and he wants to restore you. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because you've had this happen to you. I've worked with some individuals, some ladies, some men who have been in these toxic relationships. And for the ladies, especially the Christian ladies, you'll have these men who twist scripture and basically convince the women that they're going against God if they disobey anything that the man says, even though what the man is telling them goes against everything God says. But they twist scripture. And I would say, go to scripture, make sure what you're being told is truth, but also find yourself a safe place or a safe person to talk with. And that's one thing I'm harping on the church about, is that we need to do a better job in providing a safe place to share that's non-judgmental, that's loving, and that's safe. And also that doesn't come back with trite comments. Here's what I mean by that. So many times somebody who is hurting will come to the front of the church and they may confess something, they may be hurting with something, and quite frankly, sometimes the pastor just isn't really sure how to deal with it. So I've talked about, as I've tried to get the word out, I'll talk with pastors and I'll say, what's PTSD? And they can give me a fairly decent explanation of what PTSD is. And then I might say, so now what is moral injury? And usually I will get the deer in the headlights look. And so you'll have these people who may try to say something, but understanding from this perspective, what they're trying to say is probably going to be a mess because they're a mess with everything they're going through. Unfortunately, sometimes, whether they're a pastor on staff, whether they're a ministry leader, or maybe they're even a person in the seat next to them, they pat them on the back, say, you're forgiven, now go live a good life. And they need more. They need a path back to restoration. And what my goal is to try to help these pastors, to try to help these churches provide that path of restoration and provide and to train their volunteers, their ministry leaders, the pastors themselves on how to be that safe space that listens non-judgmentally and doesn't try to open up their mouth and immediately fix the situation. You know, as I told you, before the interview, my wife and I will be married 40 years this June. It's amazing that she has not smothered me in my sleep thus far. It really was in our second decade of marriage. I'm sorry, I'm a little slow. When she would come home from work and she might vent something about what had happened at work that day, and finally it dawned on me, she doesn't want me to fix it. She just wants me to listen and be supportive. And so when I changed from here's what you need to do and changed to, honey, I am so sorry that happened to you. How can I help you? And even if she said, I just need you to listen, then I shut this and I use this. It was amazing. It was great. Our relationship improved because I stopped being trying to Mr. Fix It. Sometimes we as ministers, as ministry leaders, we do the exact same thing. We try to be Mr. Fix It or Miss Fix It when we need to sometimes sit with them in the pain, let them voice how they're feeling without judgment, let them own it, and then begin that path of working with them on that restoration, of them knowing, and not just knowing here, but really understanding here that God loves them and the things that they think they've done, God will forgive.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And you know what? Also, I wonder if moral injury could also have a component where, in the sense of the pastor or the spiritual leader helping, let's say a woman comes to her pastor or spiritual leader and is talking to them about being morally injured. But I think a lot of times the pastor or the spiritual leader, they don't understand that this woman is being bullied in the home, or that this woman is being spiritually dominated, because there is so much misunderstanding about that relationship, and the mutual respect and love that goes into that relationship, and submission gets thrown in a lot. And I know for me, even being married for what's that? Yes, twisted and misused. And so I know that going to spiritual leaders over and over again, because that to me was someone who had the truth and someone could see past this relationship, see past my husband and see what was going on, because I was confused. I couldn't name it. I couldn't put my finger on it. I just knew that I was miserable and I always felt small and dismissed. But, it was like oftentimes my ex-husband would cry and sob and tell them that he'd done things he shouldn't and he was caught up in sin, and he would just get, you need to do better, and God doesn't want you to be sinning. So it was just like the leaders couldn't see past his little dog and pony show to really help and really get down to the bottom truth and ask the hard questions, about what was going on.
Set up a path of accountability for him.
Yes.
And consequences, and then also set up a path of healing for you.
Exactly. And so you just, it's kind of like a one and done, like you said. They really aim more to fix it. Let's read some scriptures. You guys need to pray more together. You need to come to church more often, those kinds of things. None of that worked because we weren't addressing the root problem here, the big, big root problem, and definitely not addressing anything close to moral injury. None of that was even, you just walk away. And now, as the wife, you're trying to just do better and seek God more for your husband and be the godly example so he'll turn from those ways and all that. But
Yeah.
yeah,
It,
this
it,
is
it was all dumped on your plate without him having to deal with any accountability at all.
exactly. And, once in a while, we'd go to somebody that would say, listen, we should probably meet and have some accountability from a male pastor to a male man struggling. But if my ex flaked, which he did every single time, as soon as I came back, he would flake. There was no reaching out, unfortunately. There was no calling him back and saying what's going on and how are things. But yeah, I think just that deeper understanding, being able to look past the surface and really get down to the bottom of what is actually going on here. And I understand we can't ask our spiritual leaders to be therapists. I get that. I really do.
But we can be biblical counselors. And
Yes.
we also need to be willing to ask, just as you just said, we also need to be willing to ask the hard questions and to demand accountability. That's scriptural. Then we're not being good under shepherds.
Very true. Yeah. Well, so I know we're about to wrap it up, but is there anything else with where you've come from and our audience? Anything else you would want to say about moral injury or something that could help anybody out there listening?
If they would be interested, I've got a book releasing on Amazon February 3rd. It's called Restoring the Broken. And you could go to just a little bit longer of a thing, or you may want to put it in your notes, restoring-the-broken.com. Somebody already took the restoringthebroken.com. But so I had to put the dash in between the words. And you can also purchase the paperback and the hardcover. And in that, I talk about, what is moral injury? Why should the church care? And here's a path forward for the church to care. And I try to, because basically it's my doctoral dissertation. Don't get scared yet. It's doctoral dissertation, and my editor and we took all of the academic language out of it because we wanted it to be plain and straightforward without all of the academic prose, because I want it to be something that somebody could just take, read, and say, ooh, I get it. And there's even suggestions in how individuals as well as ministry leaders can move forward.
So
And
is this written for the individual or is it written for the church or both?
how about this? Yes.
Okay. Okay. And so will this be as sort of a practical guide for people, again, women in our situations? Would this give them some guidance for understanding their moral injury and understanding more about what it looks like, what it is, and then maybe some ways to help?
Yes, it does exactly that. There are some chapters that address the church specifically, but there are others that address everybody. It gives, the first chapter, I talk about what is moral injury and why the church should care. The second chapter is examples of what moral injury looks like, including some ladies.
So what would be one example of what it looks like?
Well, just as you had mentioned, but what if a woman had been sexually assaulted, and after that sexual assault, the predator says something like, you deserved it, this is something you really wanted, and gets into that person's head, and they begin to really believe, maybe I really did want it, maybe I really did deserve it through something they did, and they begin to think that that's part of them and not that it was actually all on the perpetrator.
Or like, for instance, if the perpetrator hits her or even emotionally abuses her and he's angry all the time and he claims that she's bringing that out of him or that she did something that caused him to do this. That would be an example of moral injury, right?
Right, there's something wrong with you that makes me so mad. And then they begin to believe that that's actually true when it isn't.
So that injures them all the way down to their core. And then they feel that they are this bad person, I guess, to put it
Yeah,
lightly.
because guilt says I did something bad. Shame says I am bad. Moral injury says I'm not forgivable.
So it's one step more even.
Yes.
And so this person has taken on even more of that identity of who they are.
Guilty, shameful, and feeling like they can't ever go back.
Okay.
I want
Wow.
them to hear that there is a path to restoration.
Wow. Okay. That's good. That's good stuff. All right, everybody. Well, you've heard from Larry. Larry, thank you so much. And thank you for what you do for our
Yes.
veterans and our military personnel. This is incredible and much needed work. My goodness, I worked at the VA for about a year and a half. So I definitely can't say that I'm any sort of expert whatsoever. And Lizzie has sons in the military. So I know she's seen things firsthand. But boy, I tell you, when you see just the amount of hopelessness and degeneration that has happened in these veterans after they've gone and experienced unthinkable things, and then they're carrying those things with them, but trying to like fit back into a normal world when they've been completely twisted into something that they feel are that they've changed. They're not the same person anymore. And so we just don't have enough resources. And so especially faith-based resources, because really, I mean, God, he can heal and set free your very soul. And moral injury, it sounds like it goes all the way down to the bottom of people's souls.
It definitely does. There's some literature that calls it a soul injury. And that might even be a better description. To kind of finish on a high note, that gentleman I was talking about, he went home that evening and just shared everything with his wife.
Oh, that's
Every
awesome.
and because he was so afraid if he told her everything he did on his deployments that she would walk out the door. But he was pushing her away anyway.
Yeah.
And he went home and he did that. And instead of walking out the door, she thanked him for trusting her and sharing it with her. And in her opinion, there was nothing to forgive. And so I saw him a few months later, and I actually saw him a few weeks ago because he still works here. He's lost 50 pounds because he doesn't eat his frustrations anymore. He and his wife have never had a better relationship. He's begun working on repairing the relationship with his daughter, and they're doing much better. And he smiles
Mm,
as he walks around talking to people. He smiles and he laughs when he used to just grunt. It's
love that.
like he's a whole new person, and it's because he reconnected and he found that pathway to restoration and took it.
That is a beautiful way to end it, and it shows when you put the work in,
Mhm.
there is light, there is hope for
Yeah,
those that really, really want to do the work. That's
absolutely.
wonderful.
Yeah, and some people really wanna do the work, but then they don't know
Yeah.
how. They have no idea what's even wrong with them, you know? They might have an inkling or they might not, but wow, I mean, yeah, what Lizzie said, like, them putting in the work, but now they actually have a program that tells them how to put in the work, what it looks like, what they actually have hope to get better for the first time in possibly decades. And I tell you, just knowing that.
And that's what I want to do is I want to be able to help pastors be able to spread that hope.
Yeah. It's perfect. That's beautiful right there. Thank you,
Yeah.
Larry.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much
Larry.
for letting me be on your podcast.
Our pleasure and our joy.
If this episode helped you put words to something you've been feeling but couldn't explain, share it with someone who may need it too. Healing starts with understanding, and you are not alone in this. So if you want to go deeper, you can find more conversations like this on Surviving Toxic Relationships podcast or on our YouTube channel and in our new book, Love with Eyes Wide Open, where we help women recognize red flags and reconnect with truth. We are so glad that you're here. And wherever you are in your journey, there is still a path to restoration.